Right, so tonight I'm going to be telling you about the Richard III project, and I should say it wasn't actually known as the Richard III project when we first started it because we never thought we were actually going to find him, but we did. So now it's known as the Richard III project. And I'm basically going to be taking you on a bit of a romp through the entire project from start to finish. So as you heard, I'm actually a Canadian. I actually went to UBC for a couple of years and did archaeology and anthropology fieldwork here in BC. And then I went to the University of Cambridge and I did archaeology and anthropology there, and I specialized in biological anthropology. And I was actually president of the Cambridge Canadian Club. There are actually enough Canadians at Cambridge to warrant a Cambridge Canadian Club. And then I went to the University of Leicester where I did my MSc, my PhD, and my postdoc in molecular genetics. So actually what had happened was I'd been talking to my tutors at Cambridge. I thought, actually, I'm really interested in how you can use genetics to answer questions in history and archaeology. Where should I go and do a molecular genetics degree? And they all said, well, don't stay here at Cambridge. Go to the University of Leicester. It's the best place to do molecular genetics. So that's where I went, and I was lucky enough to be able to work with this chap. So this is Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys. He's the chap who invented DNA fingerprinting, and he was on my PhD committee, so I sort of lucked out there. All of my work has been combining history and archaeology with genetics. I've done a lot of work on the link between British surnames and genetics, and also things like looking at the genetic legacy of the Vikings in the north of England. So looking at men in the north of England and seeing if you can find any evidence in their DNA of the Viking migration to the north of England. And I think that's basically why I got asked to be involved in this project. I'm now a lecturer in genetics and archaeology. I think it was because of that and not because of this. This is something that my dad sent to me. So this is a chap who believes in nominative determinism. So what your name is determines what you become. And I'm his poster girl because my name is Turi King. Turi King. So he does have other people. So like there's Jem Cardinal Sin, who used to be a bishop, and there's a chap called William Headline, who used to run a newspaper, things like that. But I'm his poster girl. I don't think that's why I got involved in this project. And actually, obviously, I'm just one person in what is a very, very large team that's been involved in this project. It was actually started by this lady up here. So this is Philippa Langley, and she was the secretary of the Richard III Society, the Scottish branch of the Richard III Society. Way back in 2011, she rings up Richard Buckley, who's the co-director of the University of Leicester Archaeological Services. The way he tells it is he was on the phone for about an hour and a half to this rather passionate lady who wanted to see if she could find Richard III. And he got off the phone thinking, well, we'll never find Richard III. But this would be a really interesting project. They can do an excavation in downtown Leicester, and a bit of Leicester they don't normally get to dig in. So he starts to assemble his team. So he's got Matthew Morris here, who was the fieldwork director, kind of day to day. Joe Appleby, who was our osteologist. And then there's me, the geneticist. And what happens is in 2011, he emails me. And he goes, you know, I hear about your background in archaeology and genetics, and we're going to be doing this excavation. We're going to be doing an excavation downtown, and we're looking for the remains of somebody quite famous. I can't tell you who this is. And so my aunt actually is a staunch Ricardian. There's a Richard III Society. So I wrote back going, Richard III. And he writes back saying, yes, but don't tell anybody. He said, don't worry, we'll never actually find him. It'll be about half a day of your time. That was a very long, several years ago now, and it's been anything but half a day of my time. Obviously, he's then gone on to involve other people. So this is Professor Kevin Schurer. He was our Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research at the time, but also an English local historian who did the genealogy. People like Sarah Hainsworth, whose work I'll show you in a little bit. She's a forensic engineer who did some really interesting CT scans of the wounds. And then you also have this rather unsung hero here. This is Carl Vivian. He was the university senior video producer who took all of the photos that you'll have seen in Time magazine and so on and so forth, and through the rest of this talk. But it's gone on to involve lots and lots of people. Space Research Centre, Forensic Engineering, University of York, University of Paul Sabatier, loads and loads of different universities around the world. So it's been this really nice multidisciplinary project to be involved in. Okay, so who's Richard III? Quick potted history. Okay, he is the last king of England to die in battle, and he died in the last main battle of the Wars of the Roses. And to understand how the Wars of the Roses started, you have to go up to this guy. So this is Edward III. So normally what happens is the crown is going to pass down to his eldest son and then down to his eldest son down through the generations. But unfortunately for Edward, his eldest son died before he did. So the crown passes down to Richard II, who's only about 10 when he comes to the throne. Now, Lionel is off in Ireland, so John of Gaunt, who's the head of the House of Lancaster, is helping Richard II rule the country. Richard II grows up, John of Gaunt dies, and his son decides he wouldn't mind actually being king. So Richard II dies in slightly unusual circumstances, and Henry becomes Henry IV. Okay, that's fine. Crown then passes down through the generations, as you'd expect, until you get down to Henry VI. And he's described in the records of the time as being quite a weak king. There are periods where he's unable to rule the country. Looking at it with our modern eyes, clearly he had mental illness. Now, you've got this other noble family around. This is the House of York. And you've got this chap here. So this is Richard III's dad. He's the Duke of York. And he's actually named as Protector of England, helps to run the country when Henry VI is unable to do so. And this is where the tensions start to arise, because he's got a pretty good claim to the throne as well, through the male line, but also through the female line as well. So this is where the Wars of the Roses actually start. Richard is actually killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, but the cause is then taken up by his eldest son, Edward IV. The crown actually passes back and forth between these two a couple of times during the Wars of the Roses until Henry VI dies in slightly unusual circumstances. Edward IV gets a really nasty cold and dies. And then Richard III comes to the throne again in slightly unusual circumstances, which I won't go into here. But you would think that would be it, right? There's nobody else to make another claim for the throne. Okay, this guy comes along. This is Henry Tudor. Now, Henry Tudor is descended from a liaison between John of Gaunt and his mistress, later wife, Catherine Swynford, and he decides to make a bid for the throne. We know that he and Richard meet at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Richard III is killed. Henry becomes Henry VII, Henry Tudor, and it's said that he unites the houses of York and Lancaster by marrying Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, and this is apparently where the Tudor rose comes from. So, the action in this story all takes place in Leicester. And I don't know about you, but growing up in Canada, I had no idea where Leicester was. But it is pretty much smack dab in the middle of England. So Leicester is here. The Battle of Bosworth happens just outside of Leicester. So this is what we think Leicester looked like at about the time of Richard III. It was a walled city. And there are three places that are of interest in this particular story. So we've got the Blue Boar Inn, the Bow Bridge, and the Greyfriars Friary. So we know that Richard is aware that Henry Tudor is going to invade. So he's got himself nicely placed smack dab in the middle of England, just north of Leicester in Nottingham. He hears that Henry Tudor has landed in Wales and is making his way up to what is now the A5 to head down into London. So he comes down to Leicester and he's assembling his troops, and he stays in this sort of bijou little hotel, boutique hotel known as the White Boar Inn. And that's interesting because Richard's symbol is actually the white boar. Apparently it becomes hastily repainted after the Battle of Bosworth and becomes the Blue Boar Inn, so as to not upset Henry Tudor. So apparently he comes down and he's got his bed with him, flat packed, kind of IKEA style, has it put up for the night, take him back down again, and off he goes out over the Bow Bridge. And there's a story here. So apparently, as he's going out over the Bow Bridge, he knocks his spur on the edge of the bridge. And this old crone says to him, where you knocked your spur is where you're going to knock your head on the way back. So she's prophesizing things are not going to go well at this battle. And indeed they don't. So we know that Richard is up on a slight hill. He sees Henry Tudor slightly away from the rest of his troops, and he decides he's going to have a go and try and get him himself. Glory charge. He has a few of his men around him, and he goes down the hill on his horse, and the horse gets stuck in a marsh. He comes off his horse, and he basically goes down in battle trying to get to Henry Tudor. He gets close enough to kill his standard bearer, and then basically is killed in the heat of battle. We know about this because there's chronicles. So this is a chronicle by John Rouse. And for those of you who can't read medieval Latin, here's a handy-dandy translation. And basically it talks about how Richard goes down in battle trying to get to Henry Tudor. He is then brought back and he's buried in the choir of the church of the Greyfriars Friary in Leicester. Now, we know that Richard is stripped naked, flung over the back of a horse, and he's brought back and he's laid out in a Lancastrian mausoleum for a couple of days, basically so people can see he's actually dead. And then he's taken and he's buried in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars on the 25th of August, 1485. Now, 1538, you get the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry VIII, dissolution of the monasteries. The monasteries are all torn down. And this is where the site, the precise location of Richard's grave starts to get lost. But there are some hints. This is Robert Herrick. Now, Robert Herrick is the 3-time mayor of Leicester. He buys the land that the Greyfriars was on. If anyone is going to know where Richard is going to be buried, it's going to be him. He's born not long after the dissolution of the monasteries. Could have asked some of the friars who might still be around, or his parents, this sort of thing. Certainly he seems to think he knows where the grave is, because he's got Christopher Wren coming to visit. So this is not Christopher Wren who built St. Paul's, but Christopher Wren's dad. Christopher Wren's dad is acting as a tutor to Robert Herrick's nephew. He's obviously come for a visit, because he's writing in his diary about how he's shown a handsome stone pillar 3 foot high with this inscription, "Here lies the body of Richard III, sometime King of England." So he seems to think he knows where Richard is actually buried. The reason why that's interesting is because of this chap. So this is John Speed. He's a well-known cartographer, and he's done a nice map of Leicestershire, and he actually has little drawings. He's done the sit-in, he's done a bit about the battle. And in 1610, he's writing about how Richard's grave is overgrown with weeds. The following year, he writes a history of England, and it talks about this rumour. It's the first instance where you get this rumour, where apparently Richard III has been dug up during the dissolution of the monasteries and his body thrown into the local River Soar. Now, we don't know how reliable John Speed is. Certainly, if he did come to Leicester, because sometimes he'd send a minion and go do the drawings for you, if he did actually come, he got his friaries mixed up. He got the Blackfriars and the Greyfriars mixed up. So we don't know if he ever actually came to Leicester. But it's interesting because there's this rumour around. However, there's been a lot of scholarship over the years. So 1920, Bilson writes about how this is unlikely to be true. It's likely that the remains of Richard still lie in whatever's left of the Greyfriars, which isn't terribly much. Then in 1975, Audrey Strange is writing about it. She's part of the Richard III Society. David Baldwin writes a paper in 1986 which talks about how the grave of Richard III is likely to still be somewhere in downtown Leicester under what is now covered by a car park and buildings. This is then picked up by the press in 1993, and then it's written about in this book by John Ashdown Hill, and it's this which inspires Philippa to go on this sort of quest. So, what do we know about the friary? Not terribly much. We know that in 1255 they're being granted 18 oak trees, so we think they're building their church about then. 1402, a number of the friars are going around and saying that Henry IV shouldn't actually be king. Richard II is still alive. Henry IV shouldn't be king. Some of them actually go to Henry IV and say, you shouldn't be king. So he has a number of them hung at Tyburn in London, just to make an example of them. But then there's nothing until we know Richard is buried there in 1485. So I'm from Canada, but just living in Leicester, you learn an awful lot about Richard III. We're the one place in the country with a Richard III road. We have a Richard III statue. It's outside the Castle Gardens. It's now outside the Visitor Centre in downtown Leicester. We've got things like a Richard III pub. Little bit rough. If you go to Leicester, don't go there late at night, just a warning. We have got things like Richard III beer. We've got, these are little tiles that go on one of the bridges that go out of town. They've got the white boar on them, Richard symbol. And then we've got these two plaques. So there's one that talks about this story with the old crone who says he's going to bump his head on the way back. And then there's this one, which is next to one of the bridges in Leicester, which talks about how that rumor basically about who Richard's remains are somewhere in the river, somewhere near this bridge. I haven't seen it yet. But apparently there's a new sign next to this one that basically says, this is no longer true. And then in the cathedral when I first arrived, there was this plaque in the floor of the cathedral which basically said that the remains of Richard III lie somewhere within the parish of the cathedral in the remains of the Greyfriars site. So, what are we looking for? Essentially, this is a historical missing persons case. Richard III, missing, last seen in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars. So we know he's age 32 at the time of death, and we're expecting that he's going to have battle injuries. Now, obviously, you can go down in battle and not have any injuries on your skeletal remains, but we know quite a bit about how he went down in battle, so we're expecting that he's going to have something on the skeletal remains that will indicate that he died in battle. Possibly a hunchback with a slight build, and a lot of this can be like Shakespeare's door, who calls him a bunchback toad and gives him a withered arm and a gammy leg just for good measure. But if you go and have a look at the contemporary sources, so you've got John Rouse again, who wrote that chronicle we saw earlier, who talks about Richard having a short face and unequal shoulders, the right higher and the left lower. And then the lovely Nicholas von Popplau, who I love, because he talks about how Richard is 3 fingers. Can't work out how tall Richard was. But talks about Richard being lightly built with quite slender arms and thighs and a great heart. So, okay, so we're starting the dig, and basically we, the academics, have got 5 main aims going into this. So first and foremost, can we actually even find the Franciscan friary buildings? It's now covered with a car park and buildings now. Can we even find the friary buildings? If we can do that, can we work out where we are? If we can do that, can we work out where the church is? And if we can do that, can we work out where the choir is? And finally, can we locate the mortal remains of Richard III? We attached a set of probabilities to these. So as you can see, I mean, we basically thought this is going to be a 2-week recce dig. We'll put a couple of trenches in, we'll see if we can find the friary buildings, and then hopefully what we can do is we can go back next year with a bit of an idea as to where we are and kind of zoom in a bit more on the grave. We really didn't think we were going to find Richard. So where are we going to start looking? Okay, so this is the first really detailed map of Leicester. It's 1748, Thomas Roberts' map, and it has on it, handily-dandily, the Greyfriars. Now, this is not the Greyfriars Friary, it's the Greyfriars Precinct, but basically it's the land that Robert Herrick has bought. You can even see he's got his manor house and he has his orchard, but it's such a good map. You can do what's known as map regression with a modern Ordnance Survey map, and this gives us our search area. Okay, so in red, we have got the Friary Precinct. In dark blue, so these are all buildings, these kind of light blue things. In dark blue, we have got 3 car parks, one here, and it was the social services car park. And we all know Richard is supposed to have killed his nephews. Guess what was the office, social services? Child protection. We've then got a wall, and then we've got the old Alderman Newton School, and this is the old Alderman Newton School playground. So we've got kind of 3 areas we can look in. We don't know where the friary is. It could have been tucked in under a building somewhere here. We've basically got about 17% of the friary precinct that we can actually dig in, but we've only got the money to do 1%. So where are we going to spend our 1%? Okay. So these are our car parks again, 1, 2, and 3. So first things first, ground penetrating radar, in the hopes that we can see sort of outlines of any walls, anything that will help us sort of zoom in on things. It was, unfortunately, in time team style, any of you have seen that, completely useless. These green things are rubble, but no kind of evidence of any walls. Red things, really helpful. They are gas pipes, telephone lines, this kind of thing. All the places you don't want to dig so you don't upset your neighbors. So when Richard Buckley is thinking about where are we going to put the trenches in, he's thinking about what does he know about friaries. The main walls of friaries run east-west. So if you run long, thin trenches that run north-south, hopefully you'll cross main walls and you'll start to be able to work out where you are. So that's basically what he's doing. He's deciding, okay, 2 long, thin trenches that run along the main car park, and hopefully we can find some evidence of the friary. So not, as some of you may have heard, because of the R in the car park. There it is. And we did actually spot, I mean, we spotted it on the very first day. We were kind of joking, hey, we'll do a 1 meter by 1 meter test trench. We'll go straight down. He'll be right under it. He wasn't. So he's basically, where Carl took this photo, is basically where Richard was. So about 1.5 bays up. He's almost under the R, but not quite. So this is the 25th of August, 2012, 527 years to the day to when Richard is buried, and the trenches start going in. And what do you find? Okay, the usual things you expect to find in downtown Leicester, Victorian buildings, Victorian foundations. And 6 hours and 34 minutes in, we hit this little bit of leg bone. And we don't know where we are. We're in friary grounds. What are you going to find in friary grounds? Skeletons. So we kind of go, okay, fine. Matthew does a quick little check and goes, yeah, it looks like it's articulated. We're going to get a license to lift up to 6 sets of remains. You don't lift the first 6 and then number 7 looks really interesting. You're going to make educated decisions about which sets of remains you're going to actually excavate. So cover it up, keep going. Now, we start to find little bits, hints as to where we are. We start to find things like robbed out walls. So this is where people have come along. They've taken the bits of stone that they're interested in, leave the bits they don't want. So you can see ghosts of where walls used to be. And things like we find a medieval silver penny and our first real hints as to where we are. So we find what look like benches up against what used to be walls. So there's one this side and there's one a few meters away the other side facing each other. So where are you going to find benches in a friary? Well, it's either where the friars are going to be eating or where they're discussing the business of the day, like the chapter house. And looking at the size of this, we think that's the chapter house. So this is trench 2. It then looks like we've come down on a cloistral walk. So this was our little blog that went out. Relatively little to report right now. Richard III's still dead. Little do we know we've actually already found him. But we're just really happy because it looks like we found a building that's medieval in date. And this is where we think we are. Okay, so these are our trenches. So here's trench 1. Those are those 2 benches facing each other. So we think that's the chapter house. That looks like a cloistral walk. Now that's starting to orientate us. So we know that the church is either going to be in the north or the south of here, but you basically don't know until you put your spade in the ground. It really does vary what you're actually going to find. So where are we going to put a third trench? Well, we've got that grave there. We've got this rather thick wall there. So it's decided what we'll do is we'll put one on the other side of this brick wall here in the Alderman Newton playground. We'll put trench 3 down in there, see if we can find any evidence of the church. And pretty quickly, it looks like we found it. So we have got 2 very thick walls, a north wall and a south wall. We've got what looks like 2 separate areas. So this is looking like choir stall footing. It's ever so slightly raised, which is what you get when you put the planks across so the sound resonates underneath. And we've got tiles going in 2 different directions. So here, we've got them going diagonally. Here, they're running alongside here. So it looks like 2 separate areas. We've got stone coffin, which fortunately we found on the very last day, or we probably would have thought that it was actually Richard. We actually went back and did an excavation the following summer, and the coffin was actually lifted, and inside was this little old lady in this nice little sort of lead-lined coffin thing. So she's known as the Lady in Lead, or Lil for short. We found lots of things like tomb lettering, and we tried to spell out Richard, but we didn't have the right letters. And we found a medieval silver halfpenny from the time of Edward IV, so Richard's elder brother, right period. And lots of these tiles. This is a heraldic eagle pattern. We now call it the Chicken of Leicester pattern. So this is where we think we are. So this is that trench 3 that we've widened out, and our stone coffin, and we've got some burials, and this looks like choir stall footing. So that's starting to go, okay, so that skeleton that we found on the very first day is looking like it could be at one end of the choir. Maybe we should go back and revisit this skeleton and go and have a look. So this is the first day that we found the skeleton as this rather portentous rainstorm came over the top. And this is me and my daughter. So I'd had a phone call from Philippa, and she said, hey, we found skeletal remains. I said, oh, I'm coming down anyways. I was going to bring the guys some cookies. And they're kind of going, look, okay, there's these remains. I'm going, okay, well, we don't know where we are yet. We need context. So what we'll do is we'll just cover them up and try and protect them as best we can until we decide whether or not this is a good skeleton to come back and excavate. This is Matthew covering it up. And so we kind of go, okay, this is looking quite interesting. So of course, we realize that we've got the legs there, and the rest of what turns out to be Richard is actually back underneath the car park. So this is Matthew widening out the trench so that we can get in, and there's Carl filming away there as he's doing it. This is Joe Appleby actually excavating. I missed all of this. So we were excavating on the 4th of September and got up to about here. And the next day I went to a conference in Innsbruck. So I missed all of the rest of this. This is Joe excavating, and what you do is you kind of work your way outside in, and she's got this youngish male, and he's got injuries on his head, and she's trying to go, okay, maybe it's a friar who, met a nasty end, okay. But then she's starting to kind of work her way, and she's at the pelvis, and she's trying to find the spine, and she's kind of working her way up, and she's realizing that it's going off in a curve. And she said the hair on the back of her neck went up because she realized what she was looking at. So she calls Matthew Morris over, and she goes, I think you better go and get everybody. And so Matthew's like, oh, okay, right. So this is downtown Leicester. We're trying to do this, non-sensational. Let's do it very quietly. And Richard Buckley, co-director, is actually on the other side of that wall. He's by Trench 3 in the Alderman Newton playground. So Matthew doesn't want to shout over the top of this wall and go, hey, come and have a look at this. So what he does is he walks out of that car park, walks all the way around, walks in to go and see Richard, who, funnily enough, is actually with an expert on friaries who's confirming what they already think, that the skeleton's at one end of the choir. So he kind of sidles up to Richard and goes, oh, you might want to come and have a look at something. And apparently Richard's very off-putting, and he goes, can't you see, I'm with guests right now, I can't come. So Matthew's like, no, really, you might want to come and have a look at something. And so apparently Richard has a bit of a strop, and he goes, fine. And so he walks out of the Alderman Newton playground all the way around, comes down into the car park, looks down into Trench 1, and sees this. And apparently what he said isn't repeatable. So what have we got? We have got a youngish male, severe head injuries, severe scoliosis of the spine. His hands are in an unusual position. So you've got right over left on his hip here. Now that's not normally how you get burials in the UK. We're wondering if maybe his hands were tied. They've had a look in the soil microscope. They haven't seen any evidence of any rope, but it's just an unusual position to have the hands in. It looks like there was probably somebody in the grave to receive the body, because the legs are straight, but then they've realized that actually the grave isn't quite long enough, and so his head is up in this really, really unusual position where you don't sort of expect it to be. So it's interesting, he's in a high status part of the church, but it's like they haven't finished off the grave, and I'll show you a bit about that, more about that in a minute. Basically though, we know that Richard was killed in battle, and he's been laid out for 2 or 3 days in the height of summer, admittedly summer in England, but still height of summer. So he might be a little bit whiffy by now, so maybe they're doing it in a little bit of a hurry, but he's in a high status part of the church. So to show you a bit more about the grave, it's bath-shaped. So normally what you get in these graves is you get nice 90-degree sides. That's not what you get here. As I say, it's sort of sloping in, so it's like they just kind of really didn't finish off the grave, and maybe they were just doing it in a bit of a hurry. Now, to show you how close we came to never actually finding him, the modern Victorian foundations come to within 90 millimeters of his legs and 1 centimeter of his head. So if those Victorian builders had been that little bit more enthusiastic, we never would have found him at all. And that's the church floor level that you can actually see projected through from the other trench. So here's Richard laid out, and you can see pretty quickly he's got severe scoliosis of the spine, no evidence of a withered arm or a limp other than the fact that his feet are missing. Now, Joe can tell by looking at the ends of the bones that it's happened sometime after he was buried, but before we actually found him. And we think that probably what's happened is those Victorian builders have just been over-enthusiastic. They've gone through the ends of his legs. The soil in Leicester is very much like clay, and a lot of these bones just look like pebbles, and they probably just haven't even realized what they've done. We did, as I say, do an excavation the following summer, and we kept our eyes peeled for a spare pair of feet. But we haven't found them. They are still AWOL. Feet are still missing. So let's show you a bit about Richard's scoliosis. So these are 2 of Richard's vertebrae. They would be one on top of the other like that. What you normally find with vertebrae is they should be symmetrical. These clearly are not. These 2 surfaces would be touching one another, and as you can see, they're quite worn. So we can't say for certain, but he may have been in a certain amount of discomfort. This has been a 3D model that's been done of his spine. He had a Cobb angle, which is how they measure scoliosis, of 75. Apparently that's really quite high. But it's interesting, so Richard was known to have been in the thick of battle, a keen dancer, so clearly it wasn't holding him back as with this severe scoliosis. Now, he's got a lot of injuries on him. He's got 11 injuries on him, but 9 of those are on his head. So he has got 3 little ones here. And it's interesting, so his face is quite intact. So normally what you found in the Wars of the Roses is you often get skeletal remains that have been smashed in. So they've basically destroyed the faces so people can't actually recognize their relatives. But they've left him pretty much intact, and that's pretty much what you'd want. If you want to be able to identify him, you want to leave him intact like that. He's got 3 sucking great wounds on the top of his head. They're like slice injuries. And that's interesting because there's this ballad which talks about shaving the boar's head. That's exactly what this looks like here. We actually call this one the Death Star injury because it looks like the Death Star with a little chunk taken out. Now, Sarah's been able to do these micro CT scans, and the reason why she's interested in this is because she does a lot of kind of work on blades. Each blade will leave its own fingerprint, and what she's found that for these 2, you've got exactly the same fingerprint. It's the same weapon making those 2 injuries. Now, she couldn't get a really good one on the 3rd one, but it's starting to sort of tell you, okay, there's one individual, it looks like, and they're making these various cuts on the top of his head. And it's thought like the other ones are probably done with a sword or a dagger. Now, this is the top of Richard's head, and he's got a little one just here at the top. Now, it's not gone all the way through. It wouldn't have killed him, but as Joe tells you, he would have made him feel rather woozy. This is the base of Richard's skull, and obviously we do have a hole in the base of our skull where the spinal column goes up, but he's got 2 sucking great wounds here. He's got this one here, where it looks like a sword or a dagger has gone up, but you can actually see at the top vertebrae a little nick there, this hole, and then you can actually see on the inside of the skull where the blade is hit on the inside of the skull. Then you've got this one here, which is a slice injury off of the base of the skull. Now, either one of those would have been the ones that killed him, but we can't tell which came first because they don't overlay one another. Now, this is on the inside of one of Richard's pelvic bones, and I do remember Joe and I nattering in November 2012, just going, I have no idea how he's managed to get one on the inside of one of his pelvic bones. So what they did was they actually took the remains down to Leicester Royal Infirmary, they did 3D scans, and they worked out that it must be something like a sword or a dagger up through the right buttock and up through the pelvis that way. Now, we know that Richard was stripped naked and flung over the back of a horse, so perfect opportunity to inflict this sort of humiliation injury, though there are reenactors that will tell you that this part of the body just isn't terribly well protected by armor, so it could have been possible to do it in battle. We simply don't know how it's happened. Now, everything's looking pretty good so far. We've got a youngish male with severe battle injuries, with severe scoliosis of the spine in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars. Is he from the right period? So what do? You do radiocarbon dating, and we did this on 2 different samples and sent off to 2 separate labs. And the first things that come back is they come back as 1430 to 1460. Now that's a little bit early. We know that Richard was killed in 1485. But at the same time, we're having stable isotope analysis done. And what it's showing is that he's got a very high marine component to his diet. Now, the carbon cycle in a marine diet is much, much longer than you get in a terrestrial diet. So particularly living here in the West Coast, all of us would probably look an awful lot older if we got ourselves radiocarbon dated in 500 years' time because of this marine diet. It's known as the reservoir effect. So when you model that in, that comes back as 1455 to 1640, but we know there's no burials on this site after the dissolution of the monasteries. So this brings back 95.4% probability of 1450 to 1540, which actually nicely brackets when Richard was killed. So everything so far is pointing to these being the remains of Richard III. But in this day and age, obviously you can add DNA evidence to the pot. So this is where I came in. Now, the genetic analysis completely relies on the genealogical research. I need to have a relative to compare the DNA to. Now, Richard himself left no descendants, so are there any relatives around? Now, not just any old relative would do, and this is actually really, really important because you wouldn't believe the number of people who email me and write to me, and that's totally fine. I get lots of those every day, actually. People still write to me about this. It's when they start to try and send you bits of themselves in the post that I get a little bit worried. I do get envelopes with Q-tips in. Now, they must have been wet when they went in, because by the time I get the envelope, by the time they get to me, the envelope is dry, but it's really, really rumpled. And sometimes the writing on it is quite smudged. Because I do have one chap who keeps trying to send me his tooth. And I keep saying, no, please don't send me your tooth. I think I've managed to put him off, and I hope it's actually out, and he's not actually willing to pull it out to send it to me. But I think I've managed to put him off. But the problem is the vast majority of our DNA is an incredibly complex mixture of that of our ancestors. And this goes back 500 years. I can't just use any old relative to do this analysis. I need to use people who are related in a particular way because there's bits of our DNA that are passed down in a very simple way down through the generations. These are the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA. So let's have a look at these. So Y chromosome, it's got on it the gene which determines maleness. So basically it just goes down through the male line. So a man will pass it on to all of his sons, but none of his daughters. So again, this is quite important. I get people who write to me and say, oh, I think I've got a male line link back to Richard III. And I go, okay, that's fantastic. Let's look at your family tree. As soon as there's a girl in there, if it goes, father, grandma, I can't use it. That male line link is lost. But if I can find people who are related through the male line, I can look at their Y chromosome and see if it matches that of the skeletal remains. The other bit of DNA I can use is mitochondrial DNA. This is a small circular piece of DNA. It's in the egg. So mums pass it down to all of their children, boys and girls, but it's in the egg, so only daughters can pass it on. So what it means then is if I can find people who are related to Richard through a female line, you can have boys at either end of that chain, as long as there's girls through the rest of it, that's fine. I can do mitochondrial DNA. Look at their mitochondrial DNA, see if it matches that of the skeletal remains. Now, it's been estimated that there are between 1 and 17 million people alive today who are descended from Richard's immediate family, and I think most of them have written to me now, actually. Feels like sometimes. But I need people who are related in that particular way to be able to do the DNA analysis. So, as I say, male line, fine. I don't mind if you go up the tree sideways and down, as long as this boy is all the way through, I can do Y chromosome. Mitochondrial DNA, same thing. Don't matter if it goes up the tree sideways and down, as long as this girl's all the way through and you can have boys at either end of that chain, then I can do the analysis. And this is where the genealogy detective work came in. So, male line relatives of Richard III. Now, Henry Tudor got rid of the male line relatives of Richard III, basically. So the last one was killed in 1499 by Henry. So if you want to find living male line relatives of Richard III, you actually have to go up to his great-granddad Edmund, across to Edward, who we met earlier, and then ironically down through the House of Lancaster, their sworn enemies, until you get down to this chap. So this is Henry Somerset. He's the 5th Duke of Beaufort. And what Kevin Shure did was he traced 5 living men who are alive today, didn't know themselves to be related to one another, and they very kindly took part in this project. Now, these guys are male line all the way through. So they should have the same Y chromosome type as each other. And if that's Richard, it should match the skeletal remains, except for one tiny possible problem, which I knew quite a bit about from my previous research on surnames and the Y chromosome. And that is that the Y chromosome that a man has is that of his biological father, who may not be the father that he thinks it is. So, if there's been any medieval hanky-panky that has gone on in here, if there's a medieval milkman that has arrived on the scene, there will be a medieval milkman's Y chromosome type in here and not the one that I'm expecting to get. And actually we knew about 2 illegitimacy events. So these are where children are born out of wedlock, later legitimized. That's fine. We know who the dad is supposed to be. But if there's anything else going on in here, there won't be a Y chromosome match. Now, female line. We actually knew about this chap from the outset. This is Michael Ibsen. He's Canadian like me. And I met him on the very first day of the dig, where I kind of sidled up to him and went, hello, I'm Canadian too. Would you give me a DNA sample? And he was very sweet, and like I normally do to people. And he very kindly gave me a DNA sample on the spot. And I basically said, look, even if we don't find Richard, I'll do your Y chromosome for you. And I can tell you a little bit about that if you like. Now, he is descended from Richard III's eldest sister, Anne of York. So Cecily, his mom, will have passed down DNA to both of them. And then Anne had a daughter, who had a daughter, who had a daughter, down through the generations, until you get to Joy Ibsen, who sadly died a few years ago, but Michael Ibsen agreed to take part in the project. Now, his tree down to about here was already known in various sources, the most recent one being published in 1907. But what a chap called John Ashdown Hill did was he was able to trace down this last little bit down to Joy. And Michael was living in London and quite happy to give a DNA sample. Now, We knew that this was going to get scrutinized to death, and we had to be absolutely certain this tree was correct, because in none of these places was it ever there was no backup, no records of where this came from. It could have been someone's grandma just wrote it down on the back of an envelope. We have to be sure this is right. So this is where Kevin came in, and he traced every single piece of documentary evidence to back up that tree and make sure that it was correct. The other thing we wanted to do is, can we find anybody else? The more the merrier, basically. So we actually found this lady. This is Wendy Duldig, the irony of her surname, because it was anything but a dull dig. But anyways. So we find this name, Wendy Duldig. So Kevin and I are in his office one day, and what do? You Google. So we Googled Wendy Duldig. And on the second page, we found this mobile phone number. And Kevin was going, oh, the page is ancient. She's never going to be there. And I was like, no, I'll get a coffee. I'll go back to my office, and I'll call. So you can imagine how this call goes. Hello, my name's Terry King, and I'm from the University of Leicester, and you might have heard we're doing this project on Richard III, and we think that you might be related, and we're just wondering if you might give a DNA sample. And you can hear this nice lady on the end of the phone going, crank call, who is this? Who are you? So I was on the phone to her for about an hour, and then Kevin rang her up in the afternoon, and he was talking her through her genealogy, and she remembered some of the names. She realized we weren't completely crazy. Now, she wanted to stay anonymous. She'd seen everything that had happened to Michael. He was getting doorstepped at work. So she wanted to remain anonymous. So we had a code name for her, so we would never actually say her name out loud or anything like this. She did eventually decide that she was happy to be known. And here she is. Here, this is Wendy. And again, she lives in London as well. And the interesting thing about this particular set of people is that they're the last of their line. And it's interesting. So we've had this little window to be able to do the DNA in. So 30 years ago, we didn't really have the technology. 40 to 50 years from now, these people won't be around. And so it's like we've had this window to be able to do the DNA analysis in. So what I was looking for is that these two should have the same identical or near identical mitochondrial DNA type, and it should match the skeletal remains if it's Richard. Now, this is kind of a puzzle of two halves, because you've got the modern DNA, and that's really straightforward. I just need to get a DNA sample from Michael and Wendy, and I can do the analysis anywhere I want, and I did it at the University of Leicester and then sent it blind to somebody else who redid what I did and got the same results. Now, ancient DNA is a completely different kettle of fish, and that's because whilst we're alive, we've got nice long strands of DNA, and you do have things that come along and kind of chop it up, but you've got little mechanisms that come and stitch it back together for you. After we've died, this is not happening anymore, so the DNA starts to break down into shorter and shorter pieces. So if there's anything left, there won't be very much, and it'll be in tiny little short fragments. Now, how quickly it degrades really depends on the burial conditions. Ideally, what you would like to have is cold and dry. It's not what you tend to get in the UK. You get lots of very wet weather. But I was hopeful, because there's so many copies of mitochondrial DNA in each of our cells, I was hopeful I might at least be able to get mitochondrial DNA out. Now, the main thing you're worried about when you're working with ancient remains is contamination with modern DNA. All you need to do is breathe on these remains, and you're dumping huge amounts of your own long strands of DNA that's going to swamp out any signal of any ancient DNA that might actually be left. So this is Joe and I excavating in our very sexy CSI gear with the face masks and the double gloves and everything. And this is me actually wiggling a tooth out of Richard's mandible to be able to take away to do DNA analysis. And I'm there with my gloved hands kind of wiggling this tooth gently back and forth. It took about an hour to manage to get a tooth out, because I'm so scared. I don't want to do any damage to the mandible, and I just want to get a tooth out. So if you zoom in on this picture, you can actually see the sweat on my brow as I was doing it. And then this is working in DNA facilities. So essentially what you do from start to finish is you work under very, very clean conditions. So you've got the gloves and everything as you're going along. I did the work in 2 separate labs. So you want to do it in 2 separate labs to make sure you're getting the same results in both labs. So the first one was in the University Paul Sabatier in Toulouse, working with a very old friend of mine, Patricia Ballaresque. And the second was working with this chap here. This is Mickey Hofreiter. He's a bit of a heartthrob in the ancient DNA world. It's not why I chose his lab. He's actually one of the biggest names in ancient DNA research. And I don't know if you guys heard over here about the big kind of thing about where Richard should be buried. There was this court case that went on. Should he be in Leicester or York? Well, guess where Mickey's lab was whilst I was doing all of this? York. So here I was traveling up and down to York with bits of Richard very, very quietly to go and do the work up there. Now, obviously, the thing we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to document this as we were going through, and we had this film crew that were kind of, wanting to kind of come along and do this filming. I was like, no, I have to do this really, really carefully. I can't just have anybody come into the ancient DNA lab at all. So this is where Carl came in. So this is Carl Vivian, and you can see even his camera, so he just had the lens and the eyepiece sticking out. We didn't have, he's a very tall, lanky chap, and we didn't have the right size sort of CSI gear, so we did have one, so it's a bit figure hugging, so we do tease him about this quite a lot. But he was great, so he just came into what's known as the dirty room, where we were doing the ancient DNA, sort of popped him into a corner, and he kind of filmed things as I did pretend stuff, because I wasn't willing to get the samples out whilst he was actually there. And obviously the other thing I had to do was I had to DNA type every single person who was involved in the project to be able to rule out any contamination as I went along. Oop, taking its time. So some of you might have seen this. This is the slide I actually used on the 4th of February 2013 when we kind of stood up and said, look, these are the remains of Richard III. So this is part of the DNA sequence from Michael Ibsen's mitochondrial DNA. It's not everything I did because it'd be way too long to put on a slide, but it's to kind of show you what the DNA sequence looks like when it comes off the machine. And what you're interested in here is not the heights of these peaks, but the sequence of those 4 different colors, because the 4 different colors represent the 4 different building blocks of DNA. So this is part of the mitochondrial sequence from Michael Ibsen, and this is that same bit of sequence from Wendy Duldig. So this was a big moment for me because they were identical at this point, and so it was like, oh my goodness, okay, this is the DNA sequence that I'm looking for in those skeletal remains. And this is the same bit of sequence from skeleton 1 from the Greyfriars Dig. What it doesn't show you is all the work that went into it, because obviously what you get is you get a small fragment of DNA, and then you get another bit and it overlaps, and then you kind of tile it all together to get a nice long sequence, which you then match up against the modern DNA sequences to look for a match. So again, on top of everything else, the DNA as well was pointing to these being the remains of Richard III. The Y chromosome side of things was a different story. No DNA match. In fact, it got even more interesting because there are at least 2 false paternity events, as we nicely call it, right? So false paternity, so where the biological father is not the recorded father. One of them was recent. So you can imagine how this goes, right? So I've got these 5 guys, and one of them doesn't match the other 4. So 2 possibilities. I've screwed up, and I've been so careful. And I have done it several times, and I've given it to somebody else blind to do as well. I'm getting these same results. The other possibility is a false paternity. So what are we going to do? Okay, to put my mind at rest, I'd like another sample, just to be totally on the safe side. We also need to kind of go and discuss this with this individual, and he doesn't live terribly far away from Leicester, so Kevin and I went to go and see him, and we arranged that we would go and see him. Okay, where should we meet you? Well, actually, it's going to be at his mom's house. So we're driving down, and we're like, okay, okay. So we go and see him, and he's lovely. And we're sitting there, and we're going, okay, there's 2 possibilities here. Either I've made a mistake. Can we get another DNA sample? He's very sweet, gives another DNA sample, which I later do, and I'm getting exactly the same results. And the other possibility, obviously, is a false paternity, an illegitimacy in your family tree. That's why there isn't a match there. And it goes quiet for a second, and then his mom suddenly pipes up and goes, there always was this story that so-and-so wasn't actually the son of so-and-so. So Kevin and I, oh no. They actually kind of know where it is, so we know that it's in this line here. It's happened recently. That's fine. Okay, so we ruled that on. But then I've got these other 4, and they're not identical, but they're what you expect to find with these people who are distantly related at this level. That's telling me the Y chromosome type of Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort here. But unfortunately, it doesn't match the skeletal remains. Now, this doesn't bother me remotely. I knew going into this project that there's a false paternity rate of about 1 to 2% per generation. I was almost, this is a possibility doing this thing. There's 19 generations here. It doesn't affect the overall identification. However, it's kind of interesting because if the false paternity has happened somewhere down here, it affects the Yorkist Plantagenet kings like Edward IV, Richard III. If it comes down this way, it starts to affect things like the Lancastrian Plantagenet kings, Henry IV, V, and VI, and indirectly the Tudors, so Henry VII down that way. So published this paper December 2014, and I've been working on it solidly for 2 years, and I've had to redesign all these experiments, and it's taken me absolutely ages, and I'm really proud of this paper. It's going out, it's like, oh, this is really cool science. What do the press do? Should the Queen actually be the Queen? Show, which is basically equivalent to Jerry Springer's show. So I'm hoping she's actually thinking this is all hilarious, because obviously it doesn't affect the Queen at all, because the throne doesn't pass down through the generations in a straight line from Henry Tudor down to Elizabeth. It takes these detours and goes back and forth and eventually comes down to Elizabeth. So she should definitely be on the throne. That was the main thing that kind of came out of the whole press thing. Yes, Queen Elizabeth should be on the throne. But I don't think she's going to send me a Christmas card anytime soon. So the other thing we wanted to do is basically what's known as a Bayesian statistical analysis. This is basically a historical forensic missing persons case. You want to do what they do in forensic cases. You want to go, what's the probability of these being the remains of Richard III? We were very conservative in our approach. And basically what you have to do is go, okay, we've found these remains in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars where Richard was last seen. Are these actually Richard? So you have to ask yourself, how likely is it to be the remains of somebody who matches all of the criteria of Richard III, but isn't actually him? It's just by chance. So what you have to do is do things like, okay, so how often do you find men aged 30 to 34 in choirs of churches of friaries? And I can tell you, I had to do all the research on this because it's not published. But that's about 1 in 6. So you go 1 over 6, right? So how often do you find people with multiple battle injuries in choirs of churches of friaries? Well, actually, that's about 1 over 42. So 1 over 6 times 1 over 42. Scoliosis, 1 in 212. And basically, you go down the list. Radiocarbon dates, stable isotope data. Now, the stable isotope data fit. It showed that he had a high-status diet, but he was buried in a high-status part of a church. So it's kind of circular. So we didn't use that for this particular thing. Y chromosome doesn't match. That's fine. We know about false paternity rates, so we just build that in as well. Mitochondrial DNA match with 2 distantly related female line relatives. Now, the other thing I had to ask is, how common is this mitochondrial DNA type? Because you've got this lovely, great match for the whole mitochondrial DNA. It's actually incredibly rare. We couldn't find any instances of it in any forensic DNA databases worldwide, so it's very rare. So we built that in as well. So when you put all this together, you get what's known as a likelihood ratio. So weight of evidence of these being the remains of Richard III versus somebody by chance, and it's 6.7 million to 1. So that translates to a probability of 99.999 to 99.99999% that these are the remains of Richard III. So basically the evidence is overwhelming that these are the remains of Richard. The other thing I was interested in doing is hair and eye color, and that's because there are no contemporary portraits of Richard. They all post-date his death by about 25 to 30 years. There's 2 that vie for being the earliest portraits. One is in the Royal Collection at Windsor, and the other one is the arched frame portrait in the Society of Antiquaries in London. So what you can do is you can look at 24 of these little differences in 11 genes, and it helps you predict what somebody's hair and eye color would be. And it comes back as 96% probability of having blue eyes, so basically he had blue eyes, a 77% probability of having blonde hair. Now, it could be as light as this, but it could have darkened to be as dark as that as he's gotten older. But if you look at those 2 portraits and go, which is the most closely matching one? It's the one of the Society of Antiquaries in London. So there's a lady called Caroline Wilkinson who was at the University of Dundee. She's now at Liverpool, and she specializes in facial reconstruction, and she did a facial reconstruction of Richard, and she did it before I managed to do the DNA analysis. So since then, she's given him a bit of a makeover. He's gone slightly lighter, and his eyes are a little bit lighter colored as well. So, what's happened to Richard since? Well, he left the University of Leicester on the 22nd of March last year. We had a sort of a little ceremony, and he actually went back out to Bosworth and came into town. And you can see there were 30,000 people lining the streets, and they were throwing white roses onto the coffin. It was amazing. So Michael Ibsen, the chap who I used to do the DNA analysis, is actually a carpenter, and he made Richard's coffin, and it was actually beautiful. Anyway, so it came back, and he laid in repose in the cathedral for 3 days, and there were queues. I like this, look, King's News. That's the queue. Queues of 5 hours long to actually get in to go and see the coffin. as he lay in repose. And then on the 26th of March last year, we're just coming up to the first year anniversary. We're going to be doing some events next week. He was buried in Leicester Cathedral on the 26th of March last year, and he's now got this socking great tombstone over the top of him. So when people say, oh, can we pick him up and take him up to York? It's unlikely, because it's quite heavy. So finally, I like to show people some of the jokey things that I got sent. New car parking sign, no bearing of Denmark, or max stay 500 years. Lots about how much he would have had to pay in car parking fines, so about £1.7 million, which is almost as much as it cost to reinter him. Hide and seek champion, 527 years, pretty good going on that one. Batter of Bosworth fish and chips, and these are figurines. So there's a chap who worked on the dig, and one of his friends worked for this company called Perry Miniatures, and within a few days of us doing the announcement, they came up with these figurines. It's very sweet. It's Richard III, and he is bursting out of his car parking spot on his horse with his sword aloft, but they've also given him a little disabled sign, so I thought that was quite sweet little detail. So actually the big thing at the moment that's going on in Leicester is this. So we've got Leicester City Football Club, and this kind of equivalent to the Vancouver Whitecaps. Now this time last year they were at the bottom of the Premier League. They're now at the top. And it's apparently all down to Richard. So look, there's been lots of stuff about how they didn't win many games until Richard was reinterred. And you'll notice that actually the shirt that the guys wear is got king power on it. Now the thing is it's because the guy who owns Leicester City Football Club owns this big company called King Power. That's where the king power thing comes from. But it hasn't been lost on some people. I would like to point out as well that the Premier League Cup does have a crown on the top of it. And the chap who runs Leicester City Football Club did actually put £100,000 towards the reinterment. So maybe that has something to do with it. Certainly there's Richard III on Twitter. And BBC Newsnight, very serious news program, was even commenting that is it actually Richard III who's part of Leicester City rising to the top of the Premier League? And Richard III thinks it definitely is. So finally, as I say, when I was first approached to take part in this project, this is Richard Buckley, and he kept saying, if we find Richard III, I will eat my hat. And he kept saying this all throughout the dig, if we find Richard III, I'll eat my hat. So at the very end of the dig, some of the gang made him some little cake hats, and that's Richard duly eating one. And that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions, so do just shout.